Hi there, welcome to TAS Film and TV Reviews. So this is my review of the recent BBC miniseries The Cage, starring Sheridan Smith and Michael Socha. So I'm going to try and avoid spoilers here, but I will be talking about the main themes and ideas behind the show. So if you haven't seen it yet, then it might be best to click off and then come back here once you've watched it. So The Cage, it's a 5-episode affair, with each episode coming in at an hour, and it's created and written by former policeman Tony Schumacher, and who's previously best known for The Responder, also on the BBC. And it's directed by Al Mackay, whose previous credits include Kidnapped and Without Sin. And in terms of the cast, we've got Sheridan Smith and Michael Socha in the lead roles as Leanne and Matty respectively. And then we've got a decent sized ensemble cast, including Barry Sloane as casino owner Gary and Sophie Mensah as police detective Ning. And the setup here is that we follow Matty and Leanne, who are both struggling for different reasons, and they're both employees of a casino and are both skimming a few pounds off the takings to help them make ends meet. And the drama unfolds as they both realise what the other is up to and as their lives become intertwined around this secret. And so once the premise of the series is then set up in episode 1, it opens out to look at their respective home lives, their history and background and their relationships. And what transpires is that the initial bout of robbing, it sort of escalates for each of them, and the jeopardy then increases as they're drawn into the orbit of organised crime and also the crosshairs of casino owner Gary. And so as well as being a good drama in its own right, built around these main characters, the series as a whole also has a sort of state of the nation theme to it, and it's a gritty exploration of the impact of poverty, addiction, parenting under stress, trauma, and also love and forgiveness. And I'm going to get into the main themes of the show and what I took from it, but just to say at the outset, I really enjoyed the show and I found it to be entertaining and engaging, with likeable and well-drawn characters, and also found it to be really thought-provoking and touching as well. And it will sound weird, but I kind of enjoyed how the pain and suffering of each of the characters was etched on the screen, because that pain and suffering then also created such a visceral comparison to the later themes of forgiveness and hope, so it was really powerful for me. And both Sheridan Smith and Michael Socha play the roles with such tenderness, and we see their pain through their facial expressions and their physical form on the screen. But then of course there's also moments of levity and love. You know, it's really quite comical and funny in places actually. And then both of those lead actors, you know, they really nail that ambiguity and that sense of shifting emotional state so well. So in terms of the main themes, I thought it was a really sensitive and well told story about the impact of grief, loss and adverse childhood experiences. And as I said, we learn early on that both of our main characters, Leanne and Matty, have experienced loss, and we can see the impact of this on them throughout the series. So in Leanne's case, we know that she's lost her husband, the kid's father, and also her mum, whereas in Matty's case, we know that he lost his elder brother at a young age. And so both of them bear the scars of those losses. And I think it's fair to say that both Matty and Leanne are probably experiencing depression and anxiety. You know, you don't really need a GP appointment to confirm that. We can see it in their actions and their demeanour across the series. And so what's achieved so well in this drama is that the audience are shown the consequences of that psychological distress through each character's actions. So in Matty's case, you know, he's a gambling addict, he's got drug debt, and he's described as an alcoholic. And he makes repeated reference to feeling scared all the time. And in some ways that was quite funny, because there are at least two examples where Matty asks the female characters, Ning and Leanne, to take the lead on something because he's scared of what might happen to him. And it's like he's a diminished, sort of almost pathetic figure on the screen. You know, you get this constant sense of things just happening to him, like he's a man without any agency at all. Which, of course, is exactly what addiction does to you. You know, it strips you of your personality and your agency. It's almost like you become an unwilling participant in your own life somehow. And in Leanne's case, you know, she's experiencing a sort of all-encompassing form of health anxiety, which is probably just a manifestation of the weight of grief and loss on her. And across the drama, we also learn that even the secondary characters, particularly Ning, the policewoman, and Gary, the casino owner, you know, they've both got complicated backstories and histories of trauma and loss as well. And so for me, you know, Tony Schumacher's amazing skill across this season is helping the viewer to see that addiction and mental health difficulties, they're not personality defects or moral deficiencies. Rather, they're rooted in our lived experience, in our histories, and then they're exacerbated by current difficulties. So I thought it was a superb and extremely sensitive portrayal of that fundamental truth, which often gets overlooked in our societal discourse, and particularly within our media, which tends to see mental health difficulties or addiction just as personal failings. And then I also thought the show really picked up well on how trauma becomes familial and how adverse experiences not only affect the individual but also the people around them. So both Matty and Leanne have kids, and we see the impact of both of their issues on the children. So in one episode, Matty and Leanne have to pitch up at Matty's daughter's school to talk to her, and the teacher explains that Matty's daughter has issues, and when that's later probed by Matty, she simply says you. And of course Leanne is sort of cracking up as the pressure of caring for her two kids and Nana threatens to overwhelm her. And while she's busy at work and caring for her Nana, you know, sort of consumed by all these day-to-day pressures, and just trying to keep the show on the road and a roof over their heads, we see how eldest child Thomas is just on the fringes of getting into trouble. So, he's out smoking weed in a derelict building and he's then in danger of getting into trouble with the police. And Leanne's son Thomas, he really gets to the heart of this issue when he's later talking to his mum in the car. He says to her, "I'm just a kid, I shouldn't have all this shit to worry about. It's not my job to look after them, it's your job." And Leanne, she can't say much to that because she's self-reflective enough to know that it's true. But at the same time, she can't escape her lived experience to make her children's lives any better. And again, I thought that was superbly told by Tony Schumacher, because in my experience, when kids are drawn into gang culture, or if they're on the edge of the care system or the edge of the criminal justice system, it's frequently down to the parents' problems and how a parent's failings, and that's not meant in a negative sense, but you get the idea, then pushes the child away and into the arms of nefarious forces. And so in this series, if we look at Thomas as a young boy, and then compare him to someone like Gary, the casino owner, as a middle-aged man, we can perhaps see where that story goes in the longer term if parental love and support is not forthcoming. And then I just thought the series was an expert case study in how people across this country are struggling. So yes, both of our protagonists, Matty and Leanne, have got significant psychological and emotional well-being difficulties, but in both cases they're also struggling just with the crushing reality of day-to-day life in modern Britain. And I mentioned earlier about this being a sort of state of the nation drama. And that is exactly what it is for me, because it highlights how the system that we all live within is completely failing ordinary people. And that's most clearly seen through Leanne, because through her and her family, we see the crushing weight of housing difficulties, financial pressures, informal care needs, and also the lack of the social safety net. But we also see through the other characters, Gary and his goons at the casino, Matty's loan shark and drug dealer, how organised crime, drugs and addiction then take hold in those circumstances. And there's one scene in particular in the later episodes where Matty's drug dealer and loan shark, and he's explaining to her how much he owes and how much he can lend her at that time. And it's sort of heartbreaking because you just know that her trajectory will be the same as Matty's, that somehow she'll be forced into more desperate situations to keep the lights on and to try to keep her baby fed. So, maybe in her case it would be prostitution or being forced into the drugs trade. But the point being that once you're down, it's almost impossible to get back up because you're just crushed by the weight of debt, despair and hopelessness. So the series was absolutely a star in telling that story, in my opinion. And then finally, I thought the way in which the series emphasised the power of relationships, love and support was also really well done. So across the season, that wasn't done in a sort of corny or cliched way. And there was never this sense that there's a magical happy ending for everyone just around the corner. If only we could just love and support each other. Actually, it was far from it. But the point being made across the series, I think, is that when people support each other unconditionally, and when we're given the space to not feel defensive, angry or oppressed, when we have dignity and when our essential needs are met, then the conditions for positive outcomes are born. And clearly the relationship between Matty and Leanne is the emotional heart of the series. But in the final analysis, what we see is a kind of comradeship and unconditional support between them. And they understand each other. They're in not dissimilar circumstances with their day-to-day life, and they both recognise that when the other makes a mistake or does something to jeopardise that relationship, it's not done with malice, but as a sort of self-protection mechanism. And that's why the payoff at the end of the series feels so meaningful and emotionally powerful. Because both main characters, have to wade through 10 feet of shit in this series and across their life. And then when we get to the finale, we see in their faces, in what they say, and most importantly in what they do, what flipping the script and what being loved and supported means for both of them. And similarly, I won't give away any spoilers, but when Matty's mum gives her monologue in the final episode, I just felt incredibly emotional. It really brought a tear to the eye, because you then understand all those years of hurt and pain, of guilt and shame that he's been feeling. And that monologue, and Matty's relationship with Leanne, and then him belatedly doing the right thing, that then sets the conditions for his own forgiveness and for him to be able to move forward again in life. And so for me, the series told the story that human beings crave meaningful connection. We want trusting and loving relationships, but too often, because of our economic system, our atomization, and just the weight of day-to-day life, we're denied that. So yeah, again, it was really powerful and again, extremely well told by Tony Schumacher. And then in terms of the performances and cinematography, I really, really enjoyed the performances across the series, but in particular Sheridan Smith and Michael Socha, they're absolutely great for me here. And there's a real tenderness to both of their performances. As I mentioned, Michael Socha is sort of physically diminished and defeated here, but he still has that kind of wit and charm about him. He's a bit like a cheeky teenager in that sense. So I wondered if he was perhaps stuck in a sort of state of arrested development here. But yeah, Michael Socha's performance is just full of charm and humour as well as despair, and he gets that mix absolutely right. And Sheridan Smith, she really wears her heart on her sleeve here. She's often tearful as Leanne, and you can really feel her anxiety in sort of different situations. But then you also see how motivated Leanne is to support her children, and that despite all the difficulties, she wants to do the right thing by them. So Sheridan Smith, she really got that mix of vulnerability and steel right in this case, which is a testament to her acting really, because she's always walking that tightrope. So being able to pull it off, it's entirely believable and authentic, and it's a great performance. And of course, Liverpool is a star as well here. As with Tony Schumacher's other BBC drama, The Responder, Liverpool is front and centre in this. So, we see the fancy buildings on the Docklands and we see the numerous high-rise buildings across the skyline. But then juxtaposed against that, we also see these sort of unvarnished, gritty Liverpool back streets. The rooftop car parks and the nondescript housing estates. So I wouldn't say there's a sort of seedy underbelly to it, but it's more just the averageness of it all, and that really complements the drama for me. So yeah, in conclusion, I really enjoyed this series. You can absolutely tell that Tony Schumacher has seen these lives up close and personal, because there's a real authenticity to what he does. And I gather he's had his own sort of family experience with addiction, and also, of course, being a police officer, that's going to give him those same experiences. But as I touched on at the start, beyond the despair, there's also a sort of deep kindness to this as well. And that's because he doesn't resort to cliches or caricatures, but rather he leaves space for nuance, for ambiguity, and for complexity. And yeah, for the reasons I've outlined, he obviously has a deep understanding of the issues that affect ordinary people's lives in this country. And in that sense, as I've already touched on, this is a real state of the nation drama for me. It highlights exactly what ordinary people are up against in 2026. But the bleakness and the social commentary then being juxtaposed against what people are capable of when we support each other, when we have real family and real community around us. That's what makes this for me. So I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'd highly recommend this one to anyone. And of course, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.